Hello, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the film. I want to thank everyone for being here today, as well as everyone joining in online from across the country. I'm happy that all of you are enjoying great movies on the 10th anniversary of National Canadian Film Day. My name is Jason Ryle. I'm an independent producer, a programmer, and a proud board member of Real Canada, which puts on this amazing annual event across the country. Before we begin our Q&A and introduce our special guest, I want to thank some important sponsors that made this event possible. Canada Media Fund, Telefilm Canada, and the Government of Canada. This screening is presented in partnership with Netflix, with support from the Toronto Film School, George Brown, and the Canadian Film Centre. I would also like to thank CBC Gem for making Blood Quantum available for all our home viewers to enjoy ad-free for the day. Thank you to all our sponsors for their support. And now I want to introduce the star of the film, filmmaker, actor, producer, writer, Elamaya Tailfeathers. Nice job. I'll read your bio. Elamaya is a Blackfoot and Sami filmmaker, actor, and producer from the Kainai First Nation in Canada. She co-wrote, co-directed, and starred in The Body Remembers When the World Broke Open, which premiered at the Berlinale and earned 2 Canadian Screen Awards for Best Direction and Best Original Screenplay. Her 2021 documentary, Gima Bibitsin, The Meaning of Empathy, won the 2022 CSA for Best Documentary. She also took home the CSA for Best Actress for her starring role in Night Raiders. Elamaya Tailfeathers, congratulations.
Thank you.
You know, in reading your bio just now and sort of, preparing for this conversation, one of the things that really struck me in terms of everything that you've done in your career to date and the accolades you've received is actually something really quite historic and profound, I think. And we haven't heard enough about all the different categories of awards you have won for the work that you've done as an actor, producer, writer, director. It's astounding, really, in terms of the track record you have to date. I want to start by asking you how you came to Blood Quantum.
Thank you. My agent sent me the script. Yeah. I'm sorry.
And you read the script?
And then I read the script. And then I was like, yeah, I want to do this. I auditioned like, normal people do for these types of things. And I didn't think I got it because I didn't hear back for like almost a year. So I auditioned and then I didn't hear back. I think there was some pauses in production. And then finally I heard back about it and got a call from Jeff Barnaby, and he wanted to do a callback audition. And I was just really thrilled to even talk to him because I was a real fan of his work. I'd seen his short films. File Under Miscellaneous was just so beautiful and bizarre and cerebral, and then obviously Rhymes for Young Ghouls was a profound moment for all of us. And so having the opportunity just to speak with Jeff about his work was pretty remarkable for me at that point, and even to be considered for the role was a big deal. And so we chatted, and he was obviously very much like what you would expect from somebody who wrote a film like Blood Quantum. He was funny and he was angry, but he was also really kind in the process of auditioning, getting to know him and his work. But he insisted that I watch Incident at Restigouche, which is a well-known documentary by our, Canadian icon, Alanis Obomsawin. And Incident at Restigouche, for those of you who don't know, was made around the time that this film is set in the early 80s. And it was about settler Canadians in Jeff's home territory of Listigouche, who were essentially violently assaulting his people's rights to fishing. And there was a major conflict in that community. And that moment for Jeff, it happened when he was a child, and it was a very formative moment for him as a person, and I think deeply influenced his experience as an Indigenous or Mi'kmaq person, and also his understanding of what it means to be Indigenous in Canada. And so he insisted I watch that film to get a better idea, I think, of where he was coming from. He had a lot of righteous and justified anger, and you felt it. I felt it in the script, and had seen it in his previous work, and was just so over the moon to be given the opportunity to work with him, because I don't work a lot as an actor. And part of that has to do with the fact that I'm selective about who I work with and what I do, but it also has to do with the fact that I just don't get cast in normal stuff. But yeah, I was so thrilled to be able to work with Jeff and just watch him work as a director, as an Indigenous filmmaker myself. I was just so thrilled to be able to sit back and, well, not sit back, but have this active role in just watching him work and understanding his process. And he was really generous about that as well. Anytime I had questions, he knew that I was also a filmmaker, and it was a craft that I was working at and trying to learn. And he was very supportive of that, which I so appreciated.
I'm curious to what degree you had conversations with Jeff about the reasons why he wanted to tell this particular story. And I love that part of his inspiration for Blood Quantum was Alanis Obomsawin and her work in his community. But what kind of conversations did you have, as much as you're willing to share, about kind of, why he wanted to tell Blood Quantum specifically?
Well, he worked on this film for, I think, close to 10 years before it actually went into production. He'd written the script for this before he wrote Rhymes for Young Ghouls. And as far as I understand, it didn't seem like the Canadian film industry was ready for Blood Quantum when he wanted to put it out into the world. And also, it's kind of a long story, but I think it's really important to talk about the barriers that Indigenous filmmakers faced, specifically in trying to go from making short films to feature films. There was a lot of work done within the Indigenous film community. There was a really important report that was written by Carrie Swanson, who's with the ISO now, and Danus Goulet, who directed Night Raiders and is now directing Reservation Dogs. There was this really important report that was written that gathered data that gave us evidence that there are these barriers. There's inequity in the industry when it comes to Indigenous film and Indigenous filmmakers getting access to the funds necessary to make films. And so Jeff was he was kind of at the precipice of something really exciting for the rest of us who were kind of coming behind him in terms of making features. And Blood Quantum was this really remarkable moment for all of us. And you saw it in the tribute video when he said, this is a historic moment for Indigenous film. We've never been given an opportunity like this. And it's important to note that this, at the time, was one of the biggest budgets any of us had ever been given to make a film, and still is. And I think it's pretty remarkable that this film went on to do well at festivals, and audiences loved it, and it played well in the market. And so that was a really important moment for all of us. And so he worked at this for 10 years before he was given the trust. There's a lot of paternalism in this industry, a lot of racism in this industry when it comes to Indigenous film and just marginalized filmmakers wanting to tell our own stories. And so it took a long time before the industry was willing to give him what kind of like the bare bones, bare necessities of what he needed to be able to make Blood Quantum. So I think it's really important to make note of that in that sense. But yeah, he was a cinephile. He just loved movies. He truly loved horror films. He loved zombie films, and he just loved talking about them. Anytime we had breaks, or you don't really get a lot of breaks when you're working on film sets, but he just loved talking about film. He genuinely loved film, and he loved the craft, and he loved writing, but he was also very political, and he understood that it's a fine line to walk in terms of inviting settler audiences in to watch a film like this and sit through it and sit through the discomfort of what he's inviting people to think about. And he knew it was a fine line. And also, he made films that were entertaining for us, and that's important.
You spoke about how Jeff's shorts were inspirations to you in terms of your own career as a filmmaker. I love process questions, and sort of, you wear many hats, as we mentioned. What was it like being an actor on another filmmaker's set?
I consider myself I love learning. I consider myself a lifelong learner, and I think it's important to stay, to maintain that sort of humility of knowing that you can always learn from others. And so working with Jeff, working with Dennis Goulet, working with Tracy Deer, those are really important and extraordinary experiences to be able to be on set as an actor and watch Indigenous directors work. And I find that often with Indigenous directors, we're working from a place of of community and centering community, and so I had that experience with Jeff as well. We had the opportunity to go back and film in Listagouche. Some of it was shot in Montreal, and some of it was shot in Ganawage, and then some of it was shot in his community. And there was this really special day where we got to go to the elementary school in his community, and he made sure that all of us, we've been doing night shoots, we were exhausted. He made sure that the producers made time for us as a cast to go and meet the kids in his community, and it was just truly touching to see this person who loved his community and his people and his language more than anything. And so it was really special for us to be able to go and see that. And for me, it gave me a deeper understanding of who he was and where he worked from and why he made the work that he made.
I'm glad you mentioned that. I mean, Jeff always had such a deep love for family, community, and other Indigenous people. I mean, that was, I think, evident in his work in a lot of ways, but it really came through when you met him in person. I mean, there was such a deep well of love and protection for all those things. And it's great that you had that glimpse, going to the elementary school, for example. Was there anything else that surprised you, or was there an element of working on the production or working with Jeff that was particularly surprising, perhaps, that you didn't expect?
Oh, I have a lot of stories, but I'm not going to tell them all. He was a funny guy. He was really funny. I think what I appreciated the most is that, despite how intense this film is, how violent it is, and I think if you can't sit through this type of violence, then there's a long way to go in this country in terms of the fact that Indigenous people face systemic and structural and all sorts of violence every day. And Jeff puts that on the screen and shows us all the justified responses to violence and the ways that it reverberates through our communities and through generations in our communities. But yeah, he was a lot of fun, which was so important. We laughed throughout this entire production, and I think it's kind of just a remarkable thing to look at our communities and also Indigenous people in general and the way that we are. Like, we've been through so much, and the fact that we're still able to feel joy and laugh and build spaces for joy is really special. And he was like that. He had fun despite the intensity and all of that. There was always laughter.
Absolutely. And there were some incredibly funny moments in the film, of course. Do we have any questions? And just encourage you again to come down to the mic and share any comments or thoughts, and certainly questions you have for Elamaya. But we'll carry on the conversation just as you're coming down. I'm curious about your own work. And again, sort of we'll center Blood Quantum in this question a bit in terms of how this impacted your own work as a director, as a writer, how, if there was any sort of influence or shift from working with Jeff.
Yeah, he was fearless, the funny thing is we literally wrapped the last scene of The Body Remembers when the world broke open in Vancouver, and I had my suitcase at the production office. So wrapped that, grabbed my suitcase, got on a red eye, and flew to Montreal and started work on Blood Quantum the very next day. So I was very tired. And what I learned from him is that it's so important just to be fearless and unapologetic about our work. And to take chances and to be brave and to make sure that we're making work for our own people first and foremost.
Thank you. I have a question from the audience. Hello.
Hi.
So there's like an implication in the film that the Earth is like an organism, and there's like those animations that you see a little bit of, but it's not explained in a lot of depth per se, that the Earth is reacting to humanity and it has created a zombie infection in order to deal. I'm curious what your thoughts are. Like, did you guys talk much about the underlying kind of concept of that? Obviously, it's mostly allows for a kind of like anti-colonial critique, but I was curious what your thoughts were about why the Earth responds in this way, and why in particular it seemingly chooses to not include Indigenous people in the zombie affection. One character kind of says, "Oh, the Earth has forgotten about us," but I almost like didn't believe that. Anyways, I'm just curious what your interpretation was.
What do you think?
I mean, obviously, like, it picking white people, like, yeah, obviously that makes a lot of sense. That's what I would do if that was the Earth. But I don't know. It just like, it felt like there was like a deeper kind of metaphysics behind it all. And I was kind of curious, like, did you guys talk about that on set? Did you guys talk about like what the underlying story is? It's kind of just hinted at. And I was just curious if you had an interpretation of it.
Well, colonialism is a sickness.
Yeah. And
it's infected the Earth in pretty disgusting ways, and we're seeing it right now. Yeah, I think Jeff he had this really special way of depicting truth and things that we've actually experienced and are witnessing in these sort of like allegorical ways on screen. And he had such an interesting way of using violence as a vehicle in his narratives. And I honestly, I'm a lot more curious about how settlers respond to the violence that they see on screen, and the depictions of our mother, the Earth, and the way that she's been impacted by this sickness that's impacted our people in such in some irreparable ways, I would say.
Thanks for your question.
Thanks.
I'm curious about sort of the responses you have heard. I mean, the film's been out now for 4 years. We obviously had the pandemic there, but I'm curious about the responses you have engaged with from non-Indigenous people about the film.
They have a lot of questions. And I don't think it's necessarily the filmmaker's job to answer those questions. And that's kind of what I appreciated about Jeff's work, is he kind of like presents you with these open-ended ideas and feelings. And yeah, you know, people have questions about the violence against women, the violence against children. And yeah, it should make you uncomfortable. It should make our viewers uncomfortable to see that. But I think he's speaking to the fact that Indigenous women and children, our communities in general, have just experienced such deep and ugly forms of violence, and we continue to experience that. And he had such a, I guess you could say, brilliant way of taking that violence and turning it on its head, and putting a mirror in front of settler Canadians' faces and saying, how do you feel about this when it's your own people who are receiving that violence on screen? So yeah, a lot of questions about the violence and the misogyny. And I think he was speaking about, you know, what Indigenous women experience in this country. Because Jeff, you know, he had deep respect for Indigenous women, and I saw it in the way that he treated his wife and his family and his mother and his community. You know, he revered our women, and had a deep respect for them. And so I don't think it was like a misogynistic choice. I think it was actually just showing settler Canadians, you know, how does it feel to see this on screen when it's your own women and your own children experiencing that violence.
One of the things that I've often heard in my time at Imaginative is, how do we get to see Indigenous films, Indigenous-made films? You know, events like Cannes Film Day really are so essential to bring these works to larger audiences. But Jeff's films always seem to reach Indigenous audiences across the country. It feels like, especially Indigenous youth, they really loved his films, really saw his films, and he really was a hero for them in so many ways. And we talk about Jeff's legacy, the loss of such a great talent. But again, so much of his legacy and his power lives on in a lot of Indigenous youth who really, his stories meant so much, his films meant so much, and will continue to do so for a long time. I'd love to hear you reflect on sort of your interaction with kind of that Jeff Barnaby fan base, you know, the Indigenous fan base that really held him up and who really loved his works.
Yeah, it's a remarkable thing. I've heard Jeff talk about how becoming a filmmaker, even becoming a filmmaker, puts you in a place of privilege, or to even make it that far, you generally have to come from some form of privilege. And then, you know, speaking about access to films and the types of people who are able to access films, often Indigenous audiences are left out of the picture. And what I so appreciated about his work is that he consistently thought about things like that, about class and privilege and access and community. And it was so, I don't know, I'd never sort of experienced that before, of being part of something where everywhere I went, there were Indigenous youth and their communities who had somehow seen Blood Quantum and loved it. And it was really special. You know, it felt like I was part of something, something that changes the narrative for youth, because, you know, you internalize what you see on screen when, you know, any form of representation of yourself and your people, you internalize it. And to see ourselves on screen is a big deal, but to see ourselves on screen in such a way that it comes from a voice like Jeff's is extraordinary. And I think he planted a really important seed for future generations. And yeah, it just felt really special to know that I was just part of this like Jeff Barnaby thing.
That's beautiful. Thank you. We have another question. Hello.
Hi. Hi. No, actually, it was more of a comment. I really appreciate you sharing how much Jeff loved films, because I loved seeing different images throughout the film, and it reminded me of films that may have inspired him that he wanted to also recreate, or different things, but it was also the whole new story that was lovely. So it was really great to hear about that, and as well as the comedy and wanting to be part of the community and introducing everyone back to the community of the school. It was great to hear.
Thank you.
Do you have any parting comments, Maya, in terms of reflections of this evening, or the film itself, or Jeff, that you want to share?
I just hope that people go and watch his other work, especially his shorts, and to know that he really had to fight so hard to get his work made. And I don't think people understand how hard it is just for anybody to make a film, but to make a film at the time that he was making films, to come from his generation of filmmakers. He's 10 years older than me, or he was 10 years older than me. I think I just feel eternal gratitude for that work and that struggle and that uphill battle and everything that he sacrificed to make the films that he made. And, they might not be for everybody, but they're really important films. And he did a really, he did us all a solid,
It's very true. Thank you so much for joining us today on National Canadian Film Day, joining us here. Thank you very much for coming. Wishing you all the best. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.